All right, ready to get into some serious crane stuff. Today, it's all about assembly and disassembly safety.
Definitely a big one.
Yeah, huge for anyone who works with cranes, obviously. So whether you're a safety pro who's been doing this forever, or a crane operator, or someone who's thinking about becoming one, pay attention.
Absolutely. This is for you.
We're going to be going deep into OSHA's 1926.1404 standard.
Yep, that's the main one for keeping everyone safe during these operations.
Kind of the Bible.
Exactly, and it's not just about checking off those boxes on a form.
Right.
It's really about, making sure everyone on site actually gets to go home safe and sound, preventing those accidents before they happen.
Okay, so let's get into it. Right off the bat, the standard talks about competent and qualified personnel. It sounds like these are kind of the VIPs on the job site.
For sure. They're the ones who are, really in charge of making sure everything's done right.
So can you break that down for us a little? Like, what exactly makes someone competent versus qualified?
So a competent person is sort of your safety champion on site. They've got to be experienced, know all the hazards, and have the authority to step in and fix things when they need to.
Okay. So like a foreman or a supervisor who's been around the block and can spot trouble before it even starts.
Exactly. They're always looking out for risks, making sure everyone's following the rules. Now, a qualified person, they're more on the technical side of things.
Okay.
Especially when you're talking about assembling and disassembling a crane, they need to have the engineering background to design and analyze these operations and then approve them.
So that's where you'd bring in like a certified crane inspector or maybe an engineer who specializes in crane work.
Right. Someone with that deep technical knowledge. And here's the interesting part. OSHA says that the person actually directing the assembly, or disassembly, the AD director as they call it, that person has to be both competent and qualified, or at least have a qualified person backing them up.
Oh, wow. So you can't just grab any experienced crane operator and put them in charge of assembly and disassembly?
Nope. Not at all. They need to really understand those engineering principles and all those safety standards.
I can see why. We're talking about some pretty serious equipment here. Heavy loads, tons potential energy. You got to know what you're doing.
No doubt about it. And even if someone's got all the right qualifications, they still can't just wing it.
What do you mean?
They have to know those assembly and disassembly procedures like the back of their hand. And not just know them, but review them every single time before they start working.
Really? So even if they've put together and taken apart that same crane 100 times, they can't just go off memory?
Nope. OSHA's really clear about that. The AD director has got to review those procedures every single time right before they start. That way everyone's on the same page and you don't miss anything crucial.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Prevents those oops moments where someone realizes they forgot a step.
Exactly. Builds a good safety culture, where checking those procedures is just second nature. All right, now let's switch gears for a sec and talk about communication, especially between the crane operator and the rest of the crew. Super important when someone's moving around and the operator might not be able to see them.
You mean like if they're in a blind spot? There must be a ton of those around a crane, right?
Oh, yeah, you're right. Think about it. You've got people working on the ground, people climbing up the crane, maybe even some folks inside compartments doing inspections or maintenance. So many places where someone could be hidden from the operator's view.
Okay, so what does OSHA do about that? How do they keep everyone safe in that kind of situation?
Well, they set up a pretty simple but effective system. It's all about communication. If a crew member is about to move somewhere the operator can't see, they have to let the operator know. It's like saying, hey, watch out, I'm about to disappear.
Gotcha. So the operator always knows where everyone is, even if they can't see them directly.
Exactly. And here's the key. The operator can't move that crane an inch until they get the all clear from that crew member. They need confirmation that it's safe to move.
Wow, that's a really simple rule, but I bet it prevents a lot of accidents. Someone could get crushed if they were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
That's what it's all about, preventing those close calls. Constant communication, constant awareness. Those are lifesavers on a job site like this.
Okay, speaking of staying safe, what about working under the boom? That's got to be risky business, right?
Yeah, it can be. That's why OSHA has a general rule. No one's allowed to be under the boom when those pins are being removed.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want to be standing there if that big hunk of metal suddenly came loose.
Exactly. But of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. Sometimes the site is so cramped that there's literally nowhere else for the crew to go.
I can picture that, like a tight urban environment where there's no room to maneuver.
Right, exactly. But in those rare cases when you absolutely have to work under the boom, OSHA says you gotta have super strict safety procedures in place.
So what kind of procedures are we talking about?
Well, things like using taglines to make sure those boom sections are under control, making sure the load is perfectly balanced, and having multiple spotters on the lookout for anything that could go wrong.
So even when it's unavoidable, it's not like you just say, okay, everyone under the boom, let's do this.
Definitely not. It has to be a really controlled and cautious operation. All right, let's move on to another potential hazard here, cantilevered boom sections.
Those are the ones that are extended out but not fully supported, right?
Yeah.
That seems like it can make the crane pretty unstable.
You're right on the money. If you extend too much of the boom without the right support, the whole thing could tip over or even collapse.
Yikes.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and that's why OSHA has some pretty specific rules in place to prevent that.
So what do they say?
Well, first of all, you can't just ignore the manufacturer's limitations on how much boom you can cantilever. Those are there for a reason.
Makes sense. Don't push it further than it's designed to go.
Exactly. And if you don't have those manufacturer limits handy, you got to bring in a qualified engineer, someone who can do the calculations and tell you what's safe.
So it's all about having the right expertise to make those calls.
Yep. And speaking of things that keep the crane stable, we can't forget about those outriggers and stabilizers.
Right. The things that keep the crane from tipping over.
Pretty important, right. They're like the crane's roots, keeping it anchored to the ground,
Right.
especially when you're working with those heavy loads way out at the end of the boom. And OSHA has a whole section in the standard just for those outriggers and stabilizers.
Oh, wow. They must take them pretty seriously.
Absolutely. They lay out all kinds of rules for using them properly. For example, those outriggers have to be either fully extended or deployed exactly the way the load chart specifies. No cutting corners there.
Okay, so you have to follow the
Just
instructions.
to the letter. And you got to make sure those outriggers are set up so that they lift the crane's weight completely off the wheels.
Right. You don't want the crane wobbling around while you're trying to work.
Exactly. And don't even think about just using any old scrap wood to support those outriggers.
Really?
OSHA says you got to use proper engineered materials, stuff that's designed to handle that kind of weight and pressure.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what would happen if those outriggers weren't set up right?
Let's not go there.
Right. Every detail matters.
It sounds like it. So we've talked about those competent and qualified personnel and all that important communication, and now we're starting to get into some of those specific hazards that can pop up during assembly and disassembly.
Yep, we're just scratching the surface here.
There's always more to learn when it comes to crane safety.
That's the truth. So we've covered some of the basics, the right people, the procedures, those general safety measures. But OSHA really gets into some pretty specific stuff about crane assembly and disassembly.
Yeah. What kind of things are we talking about here? What else do they zero in on?
Well, one thing that jumps out is all the stuff about rigging.
Right. You need all those cables and slings and shackles to lift and move those heavy crane components.
Exactly. And OSHA's not messing around when it comes to rigging safety. They want to make sure you're using the right equipment and that it's all in good condition.
So no cutting corners with frayed slings or anything like that.
Definitely not. And they're really specific about things like, making sure those slings don't rub against sharp edges and that you're following the manufacturer's instructions to the letter.
You got to have a qualified rigger doing all that work, right?
Absolutely. Someone who really knows their stuff. Because with rigging, even a small mistake can turn into a major accident.
Yeah, all that weight and potential energy. You don't want anything snapping or coming loose.
Right. And that brings us to another hazard that OSHA talks about, something that can be really dangerous if you're not careful.
What's that?
Pile driving.
Ah, right. That's when you use the crane to hammer those big piles into the ground.
Exactly. And OSHA has a very specific rule about that you can't have a job attached to the crane when you're doing pile driving.
Really? Why is that?
Well, think about it. You're pounding that massive pile into the ground over and over again. It creates a lot of vibration and impact, and all that stress can transfer to the crane itself.
I see. So if you have a jibe attached, it could be a weak point.
Exactly. It could buckle or even break under all that strain.
Not a good situation.
Definitely not. OSHA wants to make sure that crane is as stable as possible during pile driving.
So no jubs allowed.
Got it. It's interesting how OSHA gets into such specifics about certain types of operations. Like they know that not all crane work is the same.
Yeah, they're trying to cover all the bases. And here's another one. Might seem kind of obvious, but it's worth emphasizing capacity limits.
Right. You got to make sure you're not overloading the crane.
Exactly. And that applies even during assembly and disassembly. You can't just lift any load you want, even if it's just for a short distance.
So you got to know how much each component weighs, what the capacity of the crane is, what the rigging can handle.
You got it. No exceeding those limits, ever. It's a good reminder that even though you're not doing a real lift during assembly or disassembly, you're still dealing with some serious weight and forces.
Right. And you got to be just as careful with those capacity limits as you would be during any other lifting operation.
Okay, so we've got rigging, pile driving, capacity limits. What else does OSHA have to say about keeping things safe during assembly and disassembly?
Well, they talk a lot about communication and just general awareness on the job site.
We talked about that system for when someone's moving out of the operator site, but it sounds like there's more to it than that.
There is. They want everyone on that crew to really understand the hazards and their own responsibilities. Remember all that stuff about the AD director making sure the crew knows what they're supposed to be doing, where the risks are, those areas they need to stay away from?
Yeah, those seem like pretty basic safety measures.
They are, but they're important. And they go even further than that. OSHA wants the AD director to really think through the operation and pinpoint any and all potential hazards that could pop up.
So it's not just a matter of having a general safety meeting and calling it a day.
Nope. OSHA wants them to be proactive. Think about all those what-if scenarios.
So what kind of hazards are we talking about here? Give us some examples.
Well, they specifically mentioned things like site conditions, making sure the ground's stable enough to support the crane and all those components.
Makes sense. You don't want the crane sinking into the mud.
Exactly. And then there's the blocking material, making sure anything you're using to support those outriggers or boom sections is strong enough and in the right place.
Right. Those are critical support points.
Yep. And if you're using another crane to help with assembly or disassembly, you got to know what loads that assist crane is going to be handling. No overloading there either.
Gotcha. Safety first, all the way.
Exactly. And then there's making sure the rigging is attached to those boom and jibe pick points correctly so you don't cause any damage.
Right. You got to know where those points are and how to rig them safely.
Yep. And then there's the center of gravity for each component. Got to keep that in mind as you're lifting and moving things around.
I guess if the weight's not balanced right, it could tip over.
Exactly. And then when you're removing those pins from the boom sections, you got to make sure those sections are supported or rigged so they don't just collapse.
Right. That's a critical moment. You need a plan for how you're going to keep everything stable.
Definitely. And then there's things like making sure those ropes and pendants don't get snagged on pins or other parts of the crane.
Oh, yeah, that could be a big problem.
It could. And you got to think about those counterweights, too, to make sure they're secured so they don't shift around and hit someone.
I wouldn't want to be anywhere near a counterweight if it started moving.
No kidding. And then there's testing that boom hoist block. Make sure it's working properly and have a backup plan in case it fails.
Brakes are kind of important on a crane.
Yeah, you could say that. And then, of course, you got to think about how the crane stability changes as you're adding or removing components. That backward stability can be tricky.
Right, it's like a constantly evolving puzzle. You got to stay one step ahead.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the wind and weather.
Oh, yeah, that can make a big difference.
Huge. A sudden gust of wind could topple a crane that's in the middle of assembly or disassembly. So the AD director's got to be really aware of those conditions and adjust the operation as needed.
So if the wind picks up, you might have to stop what you're doing, secure everything, and wait it out.
Exactly. Safety first. Always.
Well, it sounds like OSHA is really trying to cover all those potential hazards, make sure nothing gets overlooked.
They are. They want the AD director to think like a chess player, anticipate those problems before they happen.
So it's like a pre-flight checklist for pilots, but for crane assembly and disassembly. You go through all the systems, make sure everything's in tip-top shape before you start.
That's a great analogy because just like with flying a plane,
Yeah.
a small mistake or oversight can have some really bad consequences.
And it all comes back to that awareness and attention to detail, really understanding those OSHA requirements and taking them seriously.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And those are just some of the hazards that OSHA highlights in the standard.
So with all this in mind, what's the takeaway message for our listeners? For those safety professionals, crane operators, folks who are hoping to get into the field, what do they really need to know about this 1926.144 standard?
I think the biggest takeaway is that when it comes to crane assembly and disassembly, safety is more than just following a set of rules. It's a mindset.
It's about really understanding the risks and making sure everyone on the job site is looking out for each other.
Exactly. And it all starts with having the right people in charge, those competent and qualified folks who can make those tough decisions and keep everyone safe.
And it's about communication, making sure everyone understands their job, knows the hazards, and follows those safety procedures.
Absolutely. No cutting corners, no
But
assumptions.
it's about those little details, those things that might seem minor but can have major consequences if you're not careful.
Things like protecting those slings, checking those load charts, making sure those outriggers are set up perfectly.
Because at the end of the day, we all want to go home safe.
That's what it's all about.
Okay, so we've talked about all these big things, personnel, communication, hazards. But what about something that might seem kind of small, like those shipping pins? I bet they're more important than they look.
Oh, absolutely. Those shipping pins, they can cause some real headaches if they're not handled right.
Remind me, what are those pins for again?
So those are the heavy-duty pins that are used to secure those crane components during transport, when they're being shipped to the job site. Once you get to the site and you're ready to start putting the crane together, that's when you take them out.
Okay, right. So what's the big deal with the pins?
Mhm.
I mean, you just take them out, right?
Well, it's not just about taking them out, it's what you do with them after they're out.
Okay, so you're not just going to toss them in a pile on the ground, I guess.
Definitely not. OSHA's pretty clear about that. They say those pins need to be either stowed securely on the crane itself or put in a designated area where they're not going to, become a falling object hazard.
Right. You don't want a heavy pin falling from the crane and hitting someone below. I can see how something small like that could cause a big problem.
For sure. And it shows how important it is to pay attention to every detail. Think about all the possible hazards, even the ones that seem kind of minor.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about another critical point, removing those pins from the boom sections? I'm guessing that can affect the stability of the crane.
Absolutely. When those pins are in, they're holding the boom sections together, keeping things nice and stable. But as soon as you take a pin out, that section of the boom, it's basically floating free.
So it could, like, swing or drop if it's not supported properly.
Exactly. And that's why OSHA's really specific about how those boom sections, the suspension systems, any other components, how they need to be rigged or supported while you're taking those pins out.
So you can't just yank a pin and hope for the best?
Nope. OSHA says those components have to be rigged or supported so they're going to stay stable even after those pins are gone.
What kind of rigging or support are we talking about?
Well, it really depends. It depends on the crane, the operation. It could be using tag lines to control those boom sections, setting up some temporary supports, or maybe even using a second crane to help hold things steady.
So it's like having a backup plan, just in case.
Right. Because even losing stability for a second, it can cause a major accident. And you got to remember, a lot of this work happens in some pretty busy environments.
Yeah, construction sites are definitely not known for being calm and quiet.
Right. Lots of activity, moving equipment, things changing all the time. And that's another reason why OSHA is so big on considering things like wind speed and weather.
Oh, right, because a strong gust of wind could really mess things up if you're in the middle of assembling or disassembling a crane.
For sure. The AD director, they got to keep a close eye on the weather and adjust the operation if things start getting dicey.
So if the wind picks up, you might have to just pause everything, secure the crane, and wait for better conditions.
Exactly. You can't take any chances when it comes to safety.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from those qualified personnel and all those specific procedures to those little details like the shipping pins.
Yeah, we've really gone deep into all the ins and outs of crane assembly and disassembly safety.
So before we wrap things up, what's the one big message you want to leave our listeners with?
The main takeaway is this crane assembly and disassembly, it's complicated, it's risky, but you can manage those risks if you really understand this OSHA standard, the 1926.1404. It's not just about following the rules blindly, it's about knowing why those rules are there and building that safety-first mindset.
It's about making sure everyone on the job site knows their part in keeping things safe.
Exactly. And if you see something that doesn't look right or you have a question or something just feels off, speak up. Don't be afraid to say something.
Safety always comes first.
Always.
Well said. We all want to go home safe at the end of the day, and by working together, communicating clearly, and following these practices, we can make that happen. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into crane assembly and disassembly safety. Stay safe out there.